Hello again. Today I'm going to continue my discussion on the book Gospel Fictions. Today I will be discussing the idea of the Nativity of the Christ and the different and very contradictory stories that we can find in the Bible. Now, first of all, before I get into that, I'd like to discuss briefly what is history? What is the nature of history? Oftentimes people say the historical Jesus. Well, there is no historical Jesus. There is no historical Jesus because history is not just a retelling of things that have happened before us. That's not what history is. Anyone who has taken historiography, as I have, in a post-secondary setting, understands this. So I'm going to give you a definition, if I can find a decent one, online of exactly what history is. History is, first of all, it has to be written down, and it has to be of events of significance. Okay, of course, if the Christ were real, and I'm not saying he is or he isn't, that's up to for people to determine for themselves. If the Christ is real, then obviously he would be very significant. But let's start with this. Let me give you, as best I can find it, first a definition of what historiography means, and then a definition of what real history is. Historiography. The writing of history, especially the writing of history based on critical examination of sources, the selection of particulars from the authentic materials, and the synthesis of particulars into a narrative that will stand the test of critical methods. History. 1. A chronological record of events as of the life or development of a people or institution, often including an explanation of or commentary on those events. A history of the Vikings. B. A formal written account of related natural phenomena. Number 2, the branch of knowledge that records and analyzes past events. So let's clear that away to begin with. This, by definition, is not a historical book. It's not meant to be. It was never meant to be. The people who wrote it knew that it wasn't history, the classic conception, the study, the art of the study of events preceding us, which I will have already given you a definition of. So to start with, let's look at the Nativity of Christ. We have this story, and I don't need to go into detail because we've all heard it, about an angel coming down and telling Mary that she would be giving birth to Emmanuel, God is with us, etc., etc., etc. This is, of course, not chronicled at all in the book of Mark, which, despite what the author of this book seems to indicate, I personally agree with Mark's conception of the Christ. Also, which we'll be getting into later, Mark never really describes the resurrection of the Christ either, and certainly not the ascension. So, in my estimation, out of the four Gospels, this is me personally, we all have our own personal beliefs, Mark is the most accurate description of this person who I believe was a real person based on a real person who did actually live and taught, just like the Buddha did. And the Buddha doesn't have, and he's not a historical figure either, because you cannot, if you cannot give them historical references that have been written down in history, then they're not a historical figure. Unless I do something in my own personal life that is so significant that I would be part of the books of history in the future, I'm not a historical figure. I'm not history. Even me, myself personally. We as individuals aren't historical figures, but I continue to digress. Let's go and look at Mark 3:21. Now, the reason I'm reading you this verse out of the New King James Version of the Bible, which happens to be just the one I use, simply because this Bible was given to me by a man I highly respected, and this is my own personal preference to read out of this particular version. Whether you personally like it or not, this is all about our own. It's all an opinion. It's all an opinion. So this is the New King James Version of Mark chapter 3, verse 21. But when his own people heard about this, they were out to lay hold of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. They are referring to the Christ being out of his mind, crazy, and his own people, it says here in this version. Now, the New International Version of that verse says, when his family heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. So, what the point being, if the gospel is true, in which an angel comes down and tells Mary that her son is going to be Emmanuel, the Son of God, that he is going to be divine, God is with us, then certainly when Jesus is out preaching such things, his own family is not going to think he's crazy. It's another incident that leads you to believe in these contradictions in the Bible. One book in the Bible contradicts another one. It is not an historical reference Bible, because if they're full of contradictions, not just talking about interpretations, we're not just talking about people's who saw things in a different view, in a different way, that is acceptable. But when they directly contradict each other, you have to throw out the entire story. The nativity scene, the nativity story, to me, and I base this in just plain logic and just looking at things respective of what is most logical, is normally the answer to something, Occam's razor. What seems to make the most sense, the simplest answer is normally the best, and the simplest answer when it comes to the nativity of Christ is that it was just made up, quite frankly. And I think there is a lot to back up that idea. Now, let's look at the genealogy of Jesus. Well, first, continue with what I was referring to. Two of the four canonical Gospels, here I am on page 43. Matthew and Luke give accounts of the conception and birth of Jesus. John tells us not only of the incarnation, that the Logos became flesh, while Mark says nothing at all about Jesus until his baptism as a man of perhaps 30. Either Mark and John know nothing about Jesus' background and birth, or they regard him as unremarkable. Certainly Mark, the earliest gospel, knows nothing of the Annunciation or the virgin birth. It is clear from 3:20-21, which I just read, that in Mark's view, the conception of Jesus was accompanied by no angelic announcement to Mary that her son was to be, in Luke's words, Son of the Most High, and possessor of the throne of David, Luke 1:32. According to Mark, after Jesus had openly declared himself Son of Man, a heavenly being, according to Daniel 7:13, his family, on hearing this, set out to take charge of him. He is out of his mind, they said. Surely Jesus, mother, and brothers, so identified in Mark 3:31, would not have regarded Jesus' act as signs of insanity if Mark's Mary, like Luke's, had been told by the angel Gabriel that her son would be Messiah. What also strikes me is just how different the versions of the Bible are. When I read here, it says, but when his own people heard about this instead of family, and also different versions of it say instead of own people, they say when his friends heard of it. It's a significant difference when in translation when one says family and another one says friend. So not only do you have the contradictions from one book to another, but you also have the contradictions that are associated with translation. And there's no possible way that we, as 21st century Americans, English speakers, regardless of where we're from, those who read this in English, we don't know. There's no way to be sure of it. And the best answer when you're not sure of something, when you gets full of contradictions, the easiest answer and the best answer is to just throw it all out. Yes, I know. We could try to find it in its original version, but how are we going to know that it's the original version, even if we're reading it in Greek? How do we know? There's no way for us to possibly know. And that is essential. What always confuses me is how people can look at the beliefs that they have as important a belief as who is God, who is the Son of God, was Christ, did all of these things that this book claimed that he did really happen. They can look at these things and act as though they aren't critical. They are critical. Certainly they do not believe in an afterlife. They do not believe in any kind of continuation of this life in reincarnation or whatever. For them to say that is just not important. It doesn't make any sense to me. So it's a complete contradiction that Christians seem to have, many of them, who act as though, I don't know, as though they're atheists who would just go to church because it's the in thing to do. I think that probably describes most of them. Now, in Matthew, you have the genealogy of, really it's Joseph, not Christ. Please forgive any skips that might be in this video. I have problems with my camera. Okay, well, I was discussing Matthew and his genealogy of the Christ. Page 46 of Gospel Fictions. I'm not going to go into all the genealogy. It's in chapter 1 of Matthew if you want to read it yourself. After recording his altered list of names, Matthew 1:17 declares, "There was thus 14 generations," this is 1:17, "generations of all of them from Abraham to David, 14 from David unto the deportation to Babylon, and 14 from the deportation until the Messiah." The list of names that Matthew got and chronicles as the genealogy up to Joseph, and therefore somehow Christ, he gets from the book of Chronicles. And he deliberately takes out a couple of these generations. Now, Christians, if this is 100% true, then why would Matthew lie? The only word is lie. He deliberately took out 2 generations in order to fit this concept that Matthew had regarding numerology. Matthew had counted 14 names from Abraham to David and thought he counted 14 from Jeconiah to Jesus, and decided that this coincidence of numbers must indicate a prophetic pattern. But in fact, he found not 14 names from David to Jeconiah, but 18. So Matthew took the simple expedient of changing Jerome into the father of Azariah, though he was in fact the great-grandfather, and Josiah into the father of Jeconiah, though he was in fact his grandfather. A deliberate lie. But the pattern was illusionary in the first place, and Matthew could have been spared his trouble had he more carefully counted the names of the third group when proposing the pattern, for it contained not 14 names, but only 13. 14 was a significant number to Matthew because he thought, as did the author of the book of Daniel, one of his favorite Old Testament sources, in terms of divine arithmetic. Daniel 9:24 through 27 had predicted that there would be a period of 70 weeks of years from the end of the Babylon exile until the coming of the Messiah. Knowing this, Matthew's numerical imagination clicked. Not only would there be a certain number of weeks of years until the Christ, there would be a certain number of weeks of generations too. 14 equals 2, quote, weeks of generations. 3 2-week periods, 14 plus 14 plus 14, equals 6 weeks of pre-Christian generation, in that the royal line of Israel, thus with Jesus, began the Sabbath week of Jewish monarchical history. The kingdom restored under Christ. Matthew included a genealogy not because he was really interested in the ancestry of Jesus. Presumably, he had the wits to grasp the pointlessness of tracing the genealogy of Joseph, who his own narrative denies is Christ's father, but because he was interested in the pattern to the prophetic, quote, fulfillment, even if he had to juggle the numbers to achieve it. Only thing that you need to take from this is that Matthew lied. This isn't just a misstep. This isn't just something that his interpretation was different. It isn't just that his perspective was different than the other 3 Gospels. It is that he blatantly, flat out, lied. and it's not hard to find. And years ago, when I first read this book, I actually tried to find out what the Christian, the defenders of Christianity had to say online. This is back in 2004, I guess. Yeah, 2004. And Christians have a tendency to jump through hoops to come up with explanations for this lie, just like they do everything else. And if Christians would just say, you know what? This isn't 100% correct. You know what? This book has truth in it, and it has things that are not true. I wouldn't have any problem. But unfortunately, they seem to think this is their God instead of Christ or even Yahweh. So Matthew lies, and that is the crux of that argument. Let's look at the whole idea behind Christ being born in Bethlehem. Now, the idea that Christ had to be born in Bethlehem comes from Micah 5:2. I'll look the verse up and give it to you here. Micah 5:2 being interpreted, of course, as being the advent of the Christ figure, the Old Testament affirming everything of the New, and the only purpose for the Old Testament, according to the New Testament authors, was to affirm the advent of the personification of God in this Christ figure. I am going to, for expediency, just refer to Luke's account of the whole idea behind Christ having to be born in Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem, but he's raised a Nazarene. So you had to come up with a reason for this to occur. Again, this is such a stretch. Page 59 of the book. Now let's start with Luke's account of Mary's pregnancy and the reason why, according to Luke, the Christ had to go to Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph had to. In those days, a decree was issued by the Emperor Augustus for registration to be made throughout the Roman world. This was a first registration of its kind. It took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. For this purpose, everyone made his way to his own town. And so Joseph went up to Judea, from the town of Nazareth in Galilee, to register at the city of David, called Bethlehem, because he was of the house of David by descent. And with him went Mary, who was betrothed to him. She was expecting a child, and while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. Luke 2:1-6. Though Luke 1:5 dates the birth of Christ as the days of Herod, king of Judea, who died in 4 BC, he wants the journey from Galilee to Bethlehem to have occurred in response to a census called when Quirinius was governor of Syria. As historians know, the one and only census conducted while Quirinius was a legate in Syria affected only Judea, not Galilee, and took place in AD 6 through 7, a good 10 years after the death of Herod the Great. In his anxiety to relate the Galilean upbringing with the supposed Bethlehem birth, which was, according to them, prophesied by Micah, Luke confused his facts. Indeed, Luke's anxiety has involved him in such real absurdities, like the needless 90-mile journey of a woman in her last days of pregnancy, for it was the Davidic Joseph who supposedly had to be registered in this ancestral village, not the Levitical Mary. Worse yet, Luke has been forced to contrive a universal dislocation for simple tax registration. Who could imagine the efficient Romans requiring millions in the empire to journey scores or hundreds of miles to the villages of millennium-old ancestors merely to sign a tax form? Needless to say, no such event ever happened in the history of the Roman Empire. But Micah 5:2 must be fulfilled. Such thinking underlies Luke's narrative as much as it does Matthew's. She was expecting a child, and while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born, and she gave birth to her son, her firstborn. She wrapped him in his swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them to lodge in the house. So even with this wrapping his swaddling clothes and laying in the manger is also associated with things that they really go to great lengths to look through what we now call the Old Testament to find prophecies regarding Jesus Christ. Now, the idea, not only how preposterous it is that the Romans would have people go back to their city of birth in order to sign a tax form. The idea is not only ridiculous, it didn't happen. This is a historical event. Very, very easy to find out. Not chronicled. It's not true. These are lies. They're lies. They're fiction. There's so much in this book that's fiction. Is everything in this book fiction? Is everything I read in here just made up? No. And I don't believe that even Mr. Helms is saying that with his book. It's been years since I read it the first time. And I didn't really gain the idea that he is stating categorically that the Bible is false, that the New Testament is false. However, he is stating, just with common sense, folks, if you read something, you don't have to believe it simply because it's in a book. As I stated in my video called Christians, Atheists, You're 100% Wrong. Of course, no one's 100% wrong. It's hyperbolic. But you can't just look at this and say, oh my gosh, everything that's written in this book must be true. And I know it must be true because this book says it's true. It's circular logic. And if you can let loose of that idea, then Christians, you'd be a lot happier, quite frankly. This is become your idol. And that is why Lucy and I felt inclined to make a video in which we burn it. Not because we hate you, not because we hate this book, but because we want to show you this is just paper. It has words written down on it. It's not God. So, I will continue this series, probably have a couple more videos. Next one, I will be discussing the miracles of Christ. Again, the fictions involved in those, a lot of that I find is based in faith, so I'm not terribly concerned about that. It might be a shorter version, but I'm trying to keep these as short as possible. I'm sure I went into the 30-minute mark again. So next time, if you're interested, and I see that a few of you are, I will continue to be discussing this book. If you're really interested, go find a copy of it yourself. I got this book for $1 at the college bookstore when I was still in college several years ago. They were getting rid of books, and I saw gospel fictions, and I thought, that might be interesting. Didn't read it for a couple years, but anyway, thank you very much for those of you who can sit through all of this, and I will be continuing this, discussing the miracles of Christ and Helm's take on it in the next video discussing gospel fictions. Thank you very much. You all have a wonderful Wednesday.